Welcome one and all to the first day of the 2-day workshop on mediation. Before starting with the session, let me also introduce you with the MediateGuru. So MediateGuru is a social initiative led by members across the globe. And the aim of the organization is to actually bridge the gap between the general public and litigation. We are creating a social awareness campaign for showcasing mediation as the future for tomorrow and having successfully conducted various international workshops and webinars promoting alternative dispute resolution, having a reach in more than 60 countries around the world with an international family growing every day. I feel honored today to welcome our esteemed speaker for the session, Miss Sarah Blake. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, how are you?
Miss Sarah Blake is a native title mediator at the Federal Court of Australia, and she has so many feathers to her cap. And she's a global speaker, featured in 9 countries, and also the director of Resolution Institute 2018-19. Also the director of Rockingham and Secret Harbour Community Bank. She has various accreditations with Mediator Resolution Institute, and as well as with the National Mediation Standards. Also coming with the awards to her name, she has been awarded as the ENE International Business Innovator of the Year 2019. Also got the Regional Business Award in 2018, and also got the Resolution Institute Michael Klug Award 2018. Next up is the award for the Young Mediator of the Year from the Australian Dispute Centre 2016. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. And without any further ado, I would like Sarah to begin. And you can all ask your questions in the chat box and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you for the introduction. I feel really humbled to have been asked to come along and join you all today. And I'm really conscious of the depth of knowledge and experience that you all bring to this space. And I want to really encourage each of you to celebrate that wisdom and celebrate your knowledge and share that together, because when we do, we empower our profession, which ultimately helps the community. So thank you all for coming today. We might just get that PowerPoint slide going. And I've got some photos as we go through. And I want to just say that as we get started, my presentation style may be a little bit different to what you're used to. I want to keep this a little bit relaxed and engaged. I'm going to tell some stories. I'm going to share some of me. And I think that's really important for the work that I do. And I'm kind of putting it into practice for you all. So thank you today. So the topic I'm talking about is practical peacemaking and justice. How do we empower mediators to engage with people, not just facts? And this is a topic that's really close to my heart. I'm going to be sharing some of my story. I'm going to be sharing and exploring the topic. We've got a few little questions as we go through. I've got some tips, and then at the end, I'm up for your questions, and I would love to share more with you then. So as you know, my name is Sarah Blake, and I work with leaders in boards, in businesses and communities to help them navigate conflict challenges. What are the things that are stopping them moving forward? And I want to contribute to a world where our differences don't divide us, but rather they are the opportunities for change. I want to empower people to be brave enough to lean into the messiness of life and see the treasures that are buried beneath that confusion. This is my drive. This is what I do. And I feel so lucky to work in a profession that I'm so passionate about. The next slide, if we go through to the next slide, and excuse me as I work through the system, I just want to highlight to you how important the idea of disciplined communication is. We talk about communication with our parties when we do mediation, and sometimes we forget that of ourselves. And it's really important for us to strengthen the art of what we do. So please take the opportunity today to listen deeply. I want you to listen with more than your ears. I want you to listen to what it stirs up, the questions that emerge. I want you to be curious. And as you write your questions in the chat function, there's a challenge to use as few words as possible. It's a little bit easier when we're writing, but I really want you to challenge yourself about what is the most important contribution that I can make to this discussion. And again, really respecting the shared learning, the shared experiences that we all bring to the table. And that's what this notion of mediation really is about. It's how we collaborate with each other and how we help others collaborate to be more effective in their decision making. So a little bit about who I am. And I tell this because in the mediation work that I do, it's really important that I'm not just some standoffish, very structured figure that sits apart from everyone in the room. I'm asking people to be really vulnerable in the exploring of some of their most painful, difficult conflict challenges, and particularly working in the cross-cultural space. It's really important that I give parties the opportunity to have a role in the decision-making about whether I'm the right person for this case. So some of my work has taken me from remote Aboriginal communities in Australia. I've been really fortunate enough to participate in real ceremony. It's the serious business of peacemaking. I've been into really the central desert of Australia. I've been lucky enough to travel to Fiji in the Pacific and all over in my experiences of what I do. And I'm also a little bit different because I am a second generation mediator. So my father's a barrister and was involved in Australia in the very early days of mediation here. So I grew up with the language of mediation in my everyday life. And that's really changed the way I consider and practice this business of mediation. Because for me, it's so much more than just a tick box structured process. Mediation and helping parties through conflict is about helping them to become empowered, helping them to understand what skills they need to better deal with these hard conversations. And by doing so, whether we reach an agreement or not, I've increased the likelihood that when something happens in the future, they're going to be better equipped to deal with those conflict challenges. So that's a little bit about, I guess, my story. And feel free to ask me questions as we go through later. So conflicts are more than just legal facts. And it's really easy, I think, particularly those from a legal profession, to really focus on the questions about legal facts. But we know from the stories of evidence and research that people actually are the ones that drive disputes. And if left unresolved, they actually escalate and embed themselves and become conflicts. We also know that increasingly the legal lens of dispute resolution is missing the reality of commercial and community life. So reports are coming out again and again, including the reports out of North America around what people are looking for actually in their participation of mediation. They want to be a part of the process. They want to be actually curious and have some control and influence in how we do these negotiations, not just sitting there passively, perhaps as their lawyers talk. People just aren't getting the outcomes that they need and want, and particularly in situations where perhaps mediation is compulsory and they have to go through the court systems to experience this. And they come out of it with a resolution, but often there's this sense that that just wasn't a just outcome. It wasn't right. It was just a real unemotional determination of facts. And that can leave people feeling really frustrated. And in actual fact, it increases the chances of a conflict escalation with a smaller trigger. So when something happens down the track, they're going to be less inclined to engage positively with mediation because their experience wasn't what they were hoping for. So for many, justice has become an unreachable dream, that we go through a mediation process, but what does that actually mean? And in particularly in communities that are experiencing disadvantage, there's a disconnect between the access of Indigenous, particularly Indigenous justice, Indigenous law, and the Western notions of what law means. And these are the people that are experiencing multi-generational traumas. These are the people that are suffering from a disconnect from the way decisions are made in the dominant systems. So it becomes an environment where people are actually feeling hopeless. Why would we participate in mediation if we're not actually going to get a good result anyway? Why do we go to the courts? Why do we call the police when whatever we do, it's not going to make a difference? And these are the social justice questions and concerns that really drive what I do and have shaped the work that I do. So I'm going to share with you 3 examples a little bit later about that business of where we can apply mediation that really empowers that sense of justice for people. An injustice experience of mediation. And you might be surprised to hear this, although maybe you're not. And I'm really curious about that, and we're going to come to some polls later. But as we delve into this topic, let's just do a quick poll because I want to get you guys engaged too. So let's hit up poll number 1. I'm really curious around what brings you to the table today. If we can kick off poll number 1. And I'll give you a few minutes to respond to that. I always find this such an interesting question. I'm a non-lawyer practitioner, which kind of makes me a little bit unique in the field, but my breadth of experience has enabled me to navigate across multidisciplines. And I understand and work really closely with lawyers because I think this is really critical that mediation can bridge those spaces. So what are we looking at? Most of you are lawyers or doing law or engaged in the law profession. Because I want to corrupt you early about the benefits of mediation. And I love talking with universities about how powerful a tool mediation is to really helping people feel like they're a part of and have ownership in complex decision making when conflict arrives. So what really matters in mediation? Too often I've really seen those most disadvantaged further marginalised from the capacity to access justice because the mediator fails to negotiate process. And this is really highlighted to me when I was in Singapore last year for the signing of the Singapore Convention on Mediation. There was a comment that stood out for me, and it was that this notion of, do we need an Asian model of mediation? And I was really surprised on the one hand, and on the other hand, perhaps I wasn't. Because why? Why isn't it normal for practitioners to negotiate process to ensure that systematically the process itself provides legitimacy to the cultural requirements of those that are in the room? We have this model of mediation that sits on a piece of paper and you just follow these steps. But if we do that, we almost roboticize the process because we fail to engage in people. And people are complex. We are all complex, and we bring our own experiences. We bring our own. I'm just going to end that poll so we don't get distracted. So we don't get, when we engage in these processes, it's really important that we allow people to feel like this system of decision making has meaning for them. And this is what we're going to talk about later today. This is the business of complex problem solving, and it does require a multidisciplinary approach to decision making. The research is really reinforcing this and confirming this to us. And the risk we face, I think, when we are focused entirely on the legal interpretation of facts is that we miss out on the opportunities for innovation. We miss out on the breadth of ideas that are contributing to the conflict. Because if we go back and we remember that conflict is driven by people. People don't really think about facts in the heat of the moment. They're just feeling. They're feeling perhaps angry or disappointed. They might be feeling that the commercial contract was just not fulfilled. And what that does not only cost them economically, it might be costing them reputationally. It might be costing their relationship, their partnership arrangements because of this conflict. And yes, the interpretations of fact is important, but it's not the only driver we should be analysing as we mediators ask questions of the parties, as we help them peel back the layers of the conflict. And I think it's really clear that business and communities are realising that when negotiations go badly, a legal response is not enough. Reputation, well-being, the environment, relationships, health, with the COVID crisis, all of these things are part of the puzzle of problem solving. And these are really hard conversations. So I really understand why people sometimes want to avoid those hard conversations. Often it's hard to really understand, what can we do with this? How can we fix this really messy, difficult issue? How do we deal with the environment when we also have to create economic growth? These are complex issues. But we diminish the capacity of parties, of businesses, if we fixate only on those facts. I think sometimes there is an unspoken assumption that for a resolution to be good, it must be purely based on legal terms. And again, this limits the potential. So what if it was possible to help the clients achieve so much more? What if I said that the practical peacemaking can result in real, economical and sustainable outcomes? That it may not be perfect, because what is perfect these days? But it might be enough that parties can live with the outcome. And I think that's so important as we particularly practice peacemaking where social justice is an issue. Can people live with this outcome? So these are some stories that we can use to help people negotiate better outcomes and create their own justice. The first example that I want to talk about is an experience or experiences that I've had in Arnhem Land, which is the top end of Australia. In Arnhem Land, culture remains very strong. Traditional culture and law is very strong in these communities, which is a wonderful, rich environment, and they're very proud of this fact. But it also creates challenges for, I guess, the clash of systems of law. This is a cross-cultural engagement, essentially a cross-border issue, because the systems of decision-making are actually very different. We're talking about traditional systems and Western systems. So I've been very privileged to be able to work out in this space and have done so probably on and off for about 15 years in Arnhem Land. I've been practicing this business of mediation for 25 years. So much of my experiences have been working in remote Aboriginal communities. So in Arnhem Land, one particular example, I think, which is useful for you to consider around how mediators can help people engage in more than just the facts, is the requirement to negotiate good process. What do I mean by that? I mean that if I go out into this community and take them through the double triangle, which is typically talked about in terms of a model of mediation, it's not going to have a lot of meaning for people. In fact, the language doesn't translate particularly well. So what I always do in these spaces is sit down and talk with my cultural counterparts and negotiate the frames or the terms of reference for how we participate in complex decision making. Let me give you an example of that. So a young boy might have committed a crime in a community. This young man will be held to account by traditional law, but there's also a requirement for Western law to hold him to account. What do we do then if we allow him to be punished by two systems of law? And whose law has more authority in this space? Is a crime committed against a Western business, or is it against the community itself? So we start to unravel some really complex notions of what justice actually means. The work that I have done in Arnhem Land has included the negotiation of processes where we participate in traditional ceremony. And traditional ceremony is also conducted I guess simultaneously with a negotiation conducted in what would probably look more familiar to a Western mediation model. We sit down and we talk about the issues. We sit down and explore those and ask lots of questions and help parties feel comfortable understanding each other. And that's really at the heart of this question of how does mediation help people engage in justice? It's by telling and creating understanding. So it's a few photos, I think, to share with you some of that. The next one, because I'm conscious of time and I'll talk too much, is the example from East Kimberleys. East Kimberleys is again in the top end of Western Australia, and I do a lot of native title or land rights work out here. And peacemaking is a long process that sometimes we need to start right back from the beginning because we bring our assumptions to the table, particularly from a legal frame of reference. We forget our language doesn't translate. We forget our understandings of power and structure and decision making may be different from others. And we also are placing pressure on people to make really complex decisions when they're often just busy surviving. Their experiences are multi-generational trauma. And when you're in a place of survival, it's really hard to make strategic, complex decisions. So we're asking people to make hard decisions when we're essentially setting them up to fail because we know that the capacity to participate is limited. So as I do this work out here, it's really about slowing the process down. It's about helping people develop foundational skills before we ask them to make complex decisions. The next little example, I guess, of how we bring people back to the room is some of the work that I did over in Fiji. And it's a really great example of that intersection between people, commercial interests and legal facts. One of the mediation trainings I did out there, we were talking about cross-cultural issues. And I said, so what's the local language or term for mediator? And they actually didn't have a strict translation of that phrase. And it was such an insight, it didn't surprise me, but it was a surprise to others in the room that had come over from Australia. And it didn't surprise me because the role of mediator is so different wherever we come from. And that's part of us bringing ourselves to the room. We have to explore our own assumptions, our own standards, our own legal requirements with the parties so that we can all make sure we are on the same page. Because once we are, we can then be more confident that our capacity to engage effectively is legitimate, that it holds authority across the room. So how do you engage people in the process? I'm going to jump through to one of our polls because I'm going to skip to, we might be able to do quickly the second poll is, have you ever talked with parties about what else is contributing to this conflict? If we can just start that poll. It's a really curious one that I'm going to come to a little bit. And I think this is important because it's the first step really around bringing people into the room, but also about the mediator bringing themselves to the room, that we have to have that conversation. So we're sitting about 50-50 there, not far off, which is really curious to me because particularly in high complex cases, this conversation about what else is contributing is my first point of call. I'm doing I'm mapping out the conflict itself. I'm seeing whatever else is influencing because those things then impact people's capacity to make decisions. What are they thinking about? The next poll, if we can just jump quickly to that next poll. Which is rate what you think are the most critical aspects to legitimate process in mediation. As you're considering those things, I'm going to come back to it. But I want to just remind you that in conflict, it's real people. And as mediators, we are asking people to be vulnerable as they participate in negotiation. If we ourselves aren't willing to give some of ourselves to the conversation, to negotiate process, we are failing to really engage with them. We're creating a barrier, almost like that perfect glass between us and them. And they aren't going to really fully engage if they don't feel safe. So when we engage, we give them better permission to also engage. So we're bringing them back to the conversation. How I am is as important as what I do. It breaks down the barriers and we actually empower people to achieve real results. I've got some key considerations for you as we wrap up this presentation. I want you to consider these three things: justice solutions, real, economical, and sustainable. I asked you about what you do in terms of that preparation for parties. The context. I often talk with experienced mediators about the difference between the context within which the mediation is happening and the content of the conflict or dispute itself. The content is quite contained, it's quite focused, but the context is much wider. You can see that there's a diagram up there, and that's a really basic example of some of my mapping. We've got a housing dispute here about rental payments, but there's a whole pile of influencing factors. There might be departments of government that are involved in leasing. There might be maintenance issues. There might be some power games regarding who can access what housing. There's a whole pile of things that will always impact people's decision making, whether they're conscious of it or not. Now, I can't fix those things, but I can at least highlight them, because when I do so, it enables people to be much clearer in their decision making. The second point is about assumptions. We need to explore the assumptions that a good resolution might be based purely on legal terms. Justice is about sustainable outcomes. And if we only focus on the interpretation of the law, we miss out on all those other interests, the lovely iceberg approach. So I want to challenge you, particularly as lawyers, of new lawyers and emerging lawyers, to be confident to dive down deep into those interests. Be confident to explore the assumptions. Ask your questions. Ask silly questions if you need to, because often parties won't be brave enough. You need to be brave enough to ask those questions. And it is a question of legitimacy. So the process must be live and reflect the systemic, cultural, and legal needs of parties. If we don't negotiate those things with the parties, they will feel like they're participating in a forced process that has no meaning to them. And if the process has no meaning, the outcome is very unlikely also to be sustainable or matter to them. So I want you to think about these three key considerations. Understand your standards. I'll wrap up really quickly. Because if you know your standards, you are better able to know what you can negotiate on, where your wiggle room is and where it isn't. Co-design a legitimate process. Be brave enough to have that conversation. Explore the context, conflict and dispute. Broaden your perspective. Think multidisciplinary. And if you can't do it, bring in a co-mediator that can, or your cultural counterpart. And future focus that is sustainable and practical. This is what we're looking for, lasting outcomes that matter. So it's a really quick insight for you into the business that I do. I feel like I've probably overwhelmed you with information, but I'm really very happy to field your questions and link up with me wherever you usually do, so that I can keep the conversation going. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Sarah. And I think people have actually learned something from the webinar, and there's also a lot of interesting questions. Even I have some of those questions. Firstly, talking about the cultural differences and how cultural differences play a role in mediation. The question says that how difficult it is to mediate where there's a cultural difference. It's the central part of the issue.
Yep. I guess for me, having done cross-cultural work for so many years, it's not so difficult. But it is about being brave enough to ask those questions with respect. We want to create mutual respect. We want to help the parties themselves also to feel safe enough to have hard conversations. So we hold that room as mediators. Our job is to make it safe and okay to have the hard conversations. And that's why I mean bringing people into the room and making that okay. Because cultural conflict matters deeply to each of us. It is personal. And so we have to make that okay and safe in that place.
Yeah, I think that is right. And coming with that, when we say, obviously, in mediation, we're trying to create a win-win situation. So there's a question about how to manage anger of people during mediation. And, oh, just a minute. Guys, stay tuned. She will be back very soon.
And I'm back. Sorry.
That's all right. So the question was about with the anger management process of parties during mediation, and how mediators can be more persuasive in order to get out a win-win situation.
Really great question around how we manage the emotions in the room. Is that part of it?
Yeah.
I'm not afraid of letting people feel their anger, and I think it's important to allow them a space, a safe place to express their anger, because if we repress it, we actually deny them the opportunity to speak what matters to them. But it's a fine line around keeping it safe and allowing people to be heard. I think that I always check in with parties, and I'm very conscious of, we are here, you both made a commitment to come here to try and reach a resolution. That may not be possible, but I want to challenge you around the reality that if we don't reach an agreement today, what does that mean for you? So it's that reality testing is really important. But also I recognise that mediation isn't the fix for everything. And so sometimes, it's a matter of saying, look, mediation isn't going to work this time, or really knowing what's our line in the sand for when mediation is okay and it's not okay. And the more experience you have, the more comfortable you are at calling out that line in the sand.
That's right. And so I don't know why so many questions are coming with regards to the problems with mediation, but
I love it. Go.
So during the pandemic situation, what are the main problems in mediation process, from mediation going online or sometimes online and offline? So how is that problematic?
Look, there's a whole pile of things. I think we could have another conversation about that topic, and mediators across the globe are grappling with that. I think there's a risk that sometimes we miss out on the emotion that we get in the room. So we all know that so much of communication happens beyond our words. It's how you feel. It's the micro triggers that as mediators we're picking up on. And those things are much harder to be alert for when we are using webinar technology. I think too, particularly when it's a legal context of a dispute, there's this trend to keep going for those long mediations that go all day. And it concerns me because when we are focused on the screen, our capacity to hold our attention is much shorter. So we're placing a higher degree of stress both on ourselves and parties to be really effective in this space. So there's some questions around, are we giving people the best chance of reaching a good agreement, or are we rushing them to make an agreement just to get an agreement? And I think those are the sort of questions we have to grapple with.
So what do you think is more important as a mediator? Empathy for the feuding parties, or being practical or solution driven?
Such a good question. I'm a little bit of both, because I think that the way that I practice focuses on practical outcomes. But I can't do that unless I have a capacity to engage with some empathy with parties. But I'm very clear, I'm not there as a counsellor. It's not my conflict, and I'm not there to create friends. I'm very clear on what my role is, and I hold that space with a real authority. I'm not afraid to push back. But I'm also not afraid that, sometimes things are so emotional. Sometimes I will cry, particularly out in communities, and you're dealing with death, and you're dealing with disempowerment and health and elderly people and loss of culture. These are emotional issues, and they are really important. And if I didn't feel, I wouldn't be doing my job properly.
That's right. And that's actually right. And in the process of bringing yourself down to the levels, parties and communication with the parties, how does one ensure that there's no bias coming into play?
Yeah. It comes with experience. I think the more experience you get, the better able you are to do it. But you need a high level of emotional intelligence as a mediator. So you need to be self-reflective. As part of my preparation for any mediation, it's about centering myself. It's about making sure I've done my own map analysis around where I'm at, my questions. And if in doubt, asking them, I'm a little bit confused here. Can you tell me more about that? Or I just want to make sure that where my questioning is going is okay for you. So it's really about checking in with parties and a high level of emotional awareness and intelligence. And
I'm here. Actually, I'm managing the questions from my phone, so
multitasking.
Yeah. This is regarding the documentation and saying that if any dispute is regarding any document, now how the mediator can verify the genuineness during the pandemic situation, or is it through like virtual basis or like calling out the authorities?
Yeah, look, again, part of that is how you practice as a mediator. So what your model is, if your practice is more of a determinative process, that can be really critical. You can be working with the courts, you might be working with the lawyers as well, you might be working virtually. I think depending on the complexity of the case, you need to adapt and at least be asking yourselves those questions. Again, don't just question the assumptions. Don't be afraid to ask.
Personally asking, has ever there been any situation where there's been a spillover of anger from the feuding parties onto the mediator and like between the parties as well?
Look, I've worked in some very high risk, high conflict cases. I've certainly been in situations where whole of community have either just rioted or there's a real threat of violence. I guess I'm used to working in those environments and how to assess my own safety and those around me. I think I bring quite a calming presence to the situation, and I don't overinvest in what's going on, and that helps me to bring the energy down in the room. So for me, I'm able to manage that. I certainly have been in situations when parties have tried to assert their authority over me by intimidating me or trying to take control of the process, and I just see it for what it is. It's not personal. They're just trying to gain control and have power to get the outcome that they want. So I call it out if I need to. I'm not afraid to do that. I'm not afraid to say mediation isn't right at this time. And that's often the case, is that the vibration of the conflict is still at a high crisis point. That is not the time to make complex decisions. We need to calm it down before we engage in that business.
Now, after hearing from you, it just looks like a really challenging profession, though.
It's completely satisfying, though, when you have the chance to see people transform their lives and their experiences, and to walk away feeling like I saw a question somewhere around hope that popped up, and I'm dealing with a lot of cases where there is a sense of hopelessness. Why do we even bother? So when you're able to help create and craft a situation where not only has an agreement been reached, but people can walk away empowered, feeling hopeful about their future, it gives me goosebumps. That's why we do this work. This isn't about the money for me. It's, none of that really matters, because what we are here to do is to empower people to feel engaged, to make good decisions, and to live wisely.
Yeah, right. Like when I think about it, I just think that probably there are more chances I'll get impulsive while doing something of that sort. So
discipline.
That's right. And it's also for our attendees to take a note of that, because we are curious about mediation, but these are some very basic things we need to keep in mind while even learning about it and actually coming in the profession.
Yeah. And let me just say too that in terms of the profession of mediation, some people will naturally be wonderful mediators, and they have this capacity that I pick straight away. But we don't just need good mediators. We need lawyers that can advocate for their parties effectively through mediation. So the more lawyers that can understand mediation and know how to help their parties navigate that space, that's a really important role too. So you don't all have to be mediators, but if you can understand your own strengths and how you can play a role to contribute to this sense of social justice, I think that's a wonderful thing for our world.
That's right. So let's take the last question though. So when we challenge the invalid assumptions and wrong beliefs, which are the genesis of injustice, people are overreactive and not amenable for mediation. What solution do you offer for such a situation though?
Yeah, look, I see that a lot, that particularly these notions of social justice, that we are often, I guess, threatening their system of power. We're asking them to let go of some power in a decision, and some people just don't want to do that. So I actually find a lot of my work is in conflict management, that strategy. How do we help parties navigate this conflict in a way that may not reach to mediation, but at least helps them to reduce the risk? It's a risk management process. So how can we empower them with skills? How can we get them thinking more broadly about the problems? How can we get them in? And this is a big part of what I do, particularly in the high conflict cases. These cases are generally, we can't fix the differences between people because they so fundamentally are a part of those individual identities or groups. But what we can do is help them future focus. Okay, so we're not going to get a perfect outcome, but can we create a solution that at least allows you both to live with this outcome in a practical, meaningful way? You don't have to be friends, you don't have to be really great business partners, but say in a housing development or development between the community and builders and local council, how can you all come together with a focus on a shared vision for the future?
It's great to hear that we have a more people and emotion oriented crowd today.
Yes.
Coming the questions. And thank you so much, Sarah, for such a vibrant, interactive and knowledgeable session.
Thank you for having me.
I would also like to thank all the participants for joining us. And I would request everyone to actually fill the feedback form provided in the chat box. I guess it's there. Yes, it's there. And don't forget to join us again on 22nd October, that is day after tomorrow, with an amazing session by Switzerland-based mediator and attorney of law, Jonathan Borry. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you don't want to miss out on any updates by MediateGuru, follow us on our social media handles and also get to be a part of the WhatsApp group sent in the chat box.
Thank you for having me, everyone, and I wish you all the best as you emerge into the profession and contribute to global peacemaking. Thank you.